This is a session on the history of social work's interaction with neglect. But of course, when you're considering the history of neglect and social work together, you can't avoid also considering poverty, all the other aspects of deprivation, especially lack of housing or inadequate housing, mental and physical health conditions and addictions, and also offending behaviour and criminality of the parents, but also of the children. In other words, the whole of social work with children and families. So the relative emphasis placed in social health and criminal justice policy and by the social work profession on these overlapping factors has changed over the periods we're looking at. So it's a tall order to talk about social work and neglect in such a short time, but we'll give it our best go. So I'm going to start and talking you through a timeline. I'll go through it very quickly. It will be available for everybody, so you don't have to read it. And I'm just whipping through to give you a sense of what we're talking about, what we're covering. So a timeline, we, the three of us, put together from different perspectives the legislation, systems, changing discourses over time, and key people with a personal perspective as a childcare officer coming from me, first of all, between 1963 and the late 1970s. Then Michael will explore data, archival data, and sources in much more detail as a historian of the early part of the period as child and family social workers were, if you like, finding their feet. And then after a break, Marian will present her perspective as a child and family social worker, educator, and researcher from the 1980s, and especially through the lens of over 10 years of analysing serious case reviews. So I'm going to whiz through the timeline. You can have copies, so I'm just going to pull out a few things that have occurred to us. And apologies, it's very much what the three of us thought were important interviews. Right, so that's where we're at. Now, how do I? There we go. As I said, rather dense, so I'm just pulling out here 48-ish and 63-ish, because of course there were overlaps. Developments were already starting over this period. And what we looked at was what were the main pieces of legislation or reports, and then who were the people delivering the services in central government and local government, and then the names that rang bells to us. So just on this first slide, 48 to 63-ish, and I brought with me a copy of the picture post and the Beveridge report of that period, talking about a country fit for heroes. And the emphasis then was family in child welfare. Over this period, although the main legislation was about children in care, being taken into care or being adopted, in reality, the emphasis politically was the family, to support the family. I joined in this in 63, but I was still a boarding out officer. We were officers, by the way, boarding out officers, or what have I done there? Oh. What have I done? Sure. Thank you.
Stephen, I don't know if you can ask whoever's at home who's typing we can hear over, they could mute themselves, but that would be very helpful.
Would you mind, whoever is, if you're, would everybody who's listening in, please mute themselves. That will help. Just to pull out a few things from this period, I was a boarding out officer. I became a childcare officer in 1963. We were still very much working on the 1948 Act. and the 48 Act was largely about children in care. I was re-looking at the Curtis Committee, and there's nothing there about helping families. It's all about boarding out officers and children in care and children's homes. The main duties over this period of social workers are children and family social workers, and there were, of course, psychiatric social workers and moral welfare workers, and the lady almoners were also there. But our duty was essentially about deciding who should come into care, almost always voluntarily, very often because mum was having a baby, because there was no social security available for families to pay for the father to stay off work. We placed children for adoption, and we placed and supervised children in approved schools. At the same time, who was doing it? Central government, the Home Office Inspectorate, the Central Training Council Childcare, and as a childcare officer, I was certified by the Home Office to do the job, but then the local authority provided the services, and there were residues of the poor law, and much of the important work there was done by the councillors, the Children's Committee, and the local authority councillors, who were the ones who decided whether to assume parental rights, for instance. Those were the local councillors, not the social workers. And along there is a list of key people, and certainly I was brought up on John Stroud's Shaun Lamb, how to find your children of your caseload, basically. So that's it. So going on again, still in this early period. Again, what the moving on specifically to neglect. As a childcare officer, we could apply to court for a place of safety order, but we didn't do much of that. I recall very little court work in this period. It was nearly all voluntary care. It's very often parents asking for their children to be in care, and my job was often to say, no, you can't have your children in care just because, on one occasion, just because you want to go to a National Union of Students ball or something. So that was the nature of things. But the key people were the children's officers and the childcare officers. Looking at who were the agencies again, I've mentioned all of those, but right at the bottom, really importantly, and Michael will talk more about this, were the coordinating committees. These were, we talk about integrated services now, but these are incredibly important. And the children's officer, one thinks of people like Lucy Faithful, Barbara Kahan, who held sway over their housing officers and their mental welfare officers and brought them all together to discuss the problem families. So the discourse was very much about problem families in space. Okay. But the emphasis very much was on offending behaviour of the children and not so much of the parents. It was a social service responsibility service that we were providing. There wasn't all this who has committed what offence. We weren't particularly concerned about that. And then the next slide. Oh, sorry, I'm doing this on time. So these were also the other people who were part of this system, the voluntary sector. We started by talking about the cruelty man. I'll tell a little bit about my life as a childcare officer, but a key part of my life was the cruelty man, who was a lovely man who helped families, but they were the ones who took the court orders, not the childcare officers. And all of these, and I will say quite a lot of promises, absolutely crucial during this period, but also Association of Childcare Officers, APSW, the Institute of Almoners, were the key also very reports. And the list here key names again: Claire Winnicott, the people who set up social work training, Peter Townroad, to Peter Townsend, David Donniston, the LSE social policy units. So the combination of housing and income support and child welfare were very much part of the discourse. Okay, now this is where 63 onwards. Slightly messed around with my slides, so I'm not sure what context. Yeah, so from 63, we were still boarding out officers, essentially. Child and family social workers were concentrating on, but the call for the right to be, because as a childcare officer, we were meant to keep children. We were meant not to take children in care unless it was unavoidable. So it was a very pro-family system. And we were meant to try to get them back home, but we were not allowed to do anything to help the families. So a lot of the emphasis on how to work with families, a lot of the pressure for the 1963 Act, that crucial Section 1, to give social workers the right to work with families and to help families, came from the profession, the children's officers. And a lot of the journal articles in ACO, the Childcare Officer Journal, were very much about we must be allowed to help families. But the actual writing about casework was done by the almoners or by the psychiatric social workers or by American. We were very much influenced by American writers. So 1963 Act, Section 1, the emphasis there was prevention, but preventing children from coming into care. It was still coming from that story. And again, some of the discourse there are articles on the depraved and the deprived, Olive Stevenson's Minority Report on the Colwell inquiry, and I've got a copy over there of Frank Field's work. CPAG was absolutely crucially part of what the child and family social workers were doing. So a bit. So then, still as part of this period, we moved on very considerably to start with things, particularly that children were offended. So rather than preventing them coming into care, it was a question of preventing them from offending. And during this period, there was discussion about the role of the intermediate treatment officer. IT in my generation was intermediate technology. There was a huge emphasis on family therapy. That very much came in from the States, and child and adolescent CAMS services became very and again during this period, the emphasis was beginning to be on. I think it's a really important period for child and family social workers in the area of neglect, basically, because the whole family, all ages, were being considered. Intermediate treatment was for teenagers. There was a great deal of concern about family poverty. Social work lectures, I'm looking at Jane over there, introduced, we had welfare rights courses of modules on our social work training course. But probably to my way of thinking, the key piece of legislation was the 77 Homeless Persons Act, because until then, there was no right to a home. homeless families, when I started, were still in the old poor law establishment. Blokes were split off, children and adults were put in the old welfare establishment. So Kathy Come Home, I would say, is probably one of the most important pieces of that changed the nature of the child and social worker, because we ceased to have to be concerned about homelessness, which was a major reason, a major part of our work. The social workers and the children's officers were people who really argued for these changes. And again, you've got lists of some of the key pieces of legislation that can be made. Bob Holman, Olive Stevenson during this period actually was seconded to the Department for Social Security. There aren't too many social work academics these days who'd spend a period in the, well, I can't even remember what it's called these days, the welfare. It's a terrible term for income support to call it welfare. It isn't welfare, is it? Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. You've got plenty of scope to plough through that, and I really want to move on to the detail of what was really going on. So I'm now going to look at where it is, Michael, who's going to take you through some of the archive of real proper historian stuff. Oh, actually, no, sorry, I want to, yeah, one last thing, yeah. Sorry, couldn't resist that. This is the personal bit. 1963, very first day, Leicester Children's Department, I picked up this particular family who'd been literally booted out. They were on the pavement with all their possessions, and I had to cart them off to the old poor law set up and say to the bloke, disappear, can't help you. But it really was a very exciting time. 63 acts, and my job, I was a caseload of 10. I was a family caseworker, and we worked with the welfare department, we set up a home start as it was, and just a thought about that. And these are just some of the publications that are available to us, some of the back. But just contrast that with what's available now to the students on their reading list. Okay, that's my reflections, and later on towards the end of the period, I was working in Norwich, and I had to manage 6 homes, 6 flats for homeless families, for young single parents. Because the housing department wouldn't deal with them. So I was a manager of 6 flats. Again, prevention, senior childcare officer for prevention. So a lot of what people talk about now was very much there in this period of 62 to 88.
Turn the lights off so we can see the screen a bit.
Oh, right,
You
sorry.
could try the light switches behind you there.
Sorry, are you? Oh, dear, yeah.
That's better.
Thank you. But you can all get their handouts basically.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Jude, and I feel obligated to test while we're here. David, can you hear us? This is London calling.
Hello, Edinburgh replying. Yes, careful loud speaking and directing your voice to the microphone will help. It is audible, but it's not the best. But I think I'm getting by okay. But I'm sure, Michael, that you're used to speaking to big halls, so treat it as a big hall.
Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to pick up where effectively.
Sorry,
June-
Michael, sorry. I can't see your slides. Are there slides? I don't know whether.
That's work. Everything there.
The share screen issue, I think.
I'm just going to work with the. What shall I
Something's
do?
happening. Yeah,
So you'll be able to see those, but we can't really see them quite so well.
that's good. That's good.
I'm just.
Shall I stop sharing these?
Yeah, share the window rather than
Yeah,
the
share the
presentation. Oh, and then do from beginning. It should be.
So.
See that, David?
We can see those.
Yeah, yeah.
That's good. That's good.
Okay, right. Let's soldier on. So, what am I going to talk about today? Child neglect, family welfare, and social work in the state, funnily enough. So, effectively focusing on the 1940s as this period of change, the foundation of the welfare state, and the different forms of social work policies and practices built around this idea of the problem family that was a subject of social work discourse and policy by and large, until for a whole variety of reasons by the end of the period a whole new set of languages and forms of understanding came into being, which made a lot of these older ways of thinking more redundant. So it's about the death of the old system and the rise of the new, effectively, during this period of time, capturing a lot of what June has been saying. So this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to talk firstly about a bit of background to what this term, the problem family, is, where it comes from, what it signifies, and how it's related to the formative politics of the welfare state in Britain after the end of the Second World War. Then I'm going to talk a bit about how this concept relates to different professional understandings, because as much as June has focused on children's officers and social workers, it was about eclipsing the relative power of a different group, an influential group, the public health, medical officers of health particularly, and about professional wrangle there. Then I want to talk a bit more about what coordinating committees were, where they came from, what they did, and how they relate to different understandings of neglect, about a lack of something in the home. And then a bit more about the research that I've been doing in a very cursory way, effectively using historic social work case files to understand what life was like and the different ways they shed light on our understanding of the past. So that includes the family service units in particular. And then lastly, how this sort of moment of time between roughly the 1940s and the 1970s, it sort of broke apart very quickly in terms of the legislation, the structures, the organisations, and push into this new period, which I'm hoping Marian will pick up on as we move into the 70s and the 80s. So that's what I'm going to do. So a bit of background to what a problem family is. So here, treat you down, David. Here is where does the term problem family come from? So this report is the first place that mentions it. It's a report called Our Towns by the Women's Group of Public Welfare, published in 1943 during the Second World War. Now, the group itself is made up of mainly progressive, left-leaning women, often associated with suffrage campaigns of old. So it's not a kind of a rightist eugenicist treatise. It's quite a progressive one, what it's trying to do. And the report is published in 1943 as a result of evacuation. Now, during the Second World War, under the threats of proposed bombs, most urban areas of the country, as a planned exercise, Operation Pied Piper, was sent from the countryside into, sorry, all the way around, sent from the towns into the countryside for their safety. And although it had been planned meticulously in advance by different government organisations, it was a bit of a moral panic, and in a sense that you had children left at train stations or being picked up in 2 or 3s or trying to find somewhere. It didn't work as it was planned. And then there were all sorts of lurid stories about children who were bedwetting, who didn't know what grass was, and all these kinds of tales. And so there's been a lot of work about how they're fabricated or not. But the important thing is that this report was very influential, much as Beveridge was as well. And the quote that I've got here about the effect of the evacuation was to flood the dark places with light and bring home to the national consciousness that the submerged tenth described by Charles Booth. So that's a reference I'll come to in a moment ago, but it's important that this report is referencing that older way of understanding poverty and slum areas. still exists in our towns like a hidden sore. Poor, dirty, and crude in habits, again, some of those moral panic elements, an intolerable and degrading burden to decent people, force my poverty to neighbour with it. And so this is where the term comes in, about when they first used this idea of a problem family, because effectively children are being transported into the countryside. So they say the problem families are those that are always on the edge of pauperism and crime, riddled with mental and physical defects, in and out of the ports for child neglect, a menace to the community, of which the gravity is at all proportion to their numbers. So they're consuming the energies, the time, the resources of the state because they're not being cared for properly. This was a moment in the 1940s during the war where it has this presence. So let's pause for a moment, because I'm trying to capture the problem family. That's where the term is. That's the kind of language that's being used to describe what a problem family is, and when the concept is first articulated. Now, my moral help on my PhD, John McNichol, he wrote an article when the term underclass first became popular back in the 1980s, and he was looking into the history of the concept. And so there's the bits in bold I'm going to read out because they're the important things here in thinking about shedding light on something that's been there. So he argued in 1987 that the concept of an intergenerational underclass displaying a high concentration of social problems, which is effectively what's been talked about a moment ago with the problem family, has been reconstructed periodically over at least the past 100 years. Which leads us on to this. So this is my PhD supervisor, John Welshman's book. And it's basically, these are each of the chapters that he has in his book. And he describes in the introduction how the terms were based on the same premise. That is, that there are a certain group in society disproportionately responsible for social ills that attract attention. When they try to understand them, it was a lot of anxieties about the poor behavioural attributes being passed from parents onto children across the generations. It's a small group in society responsible for ills. The term comes into fashion. It has a real resonance and understanding. It's criticised. The label itself obtains a stigma. Then it goes out of fashion, only to be replaced by a new one, effectively describing and capturing the same thing. And that's the basic argument that John McNichol first put across in the 1980s. And here it's important that this idea of residuum submerged tent put across by Boo is being drawn upon in this problem family. They're referencing the existing body of literature and understanding about urban poverty and neglect. So it's important to situate that in understanding the concept and why they're referring to those particular sets of language. So the Women's Group on Public Welfare, their 1943 Our Towns report is very influential. Oh dear. Aha, success. So if I stop sharing and then share again, does this bring me back where we left it? Fantastic. Okay, so as a follow-up report to Our Towns report is this book on the neglected child and his family. Now, this is far less influential and significant to the public imagination. So it's not being reported about in the national press in a way that Our Towns is, but in the professional press, it has far more resonance in trying to capture about how we take this understanding of a problem family or the problem family and a group in society into concrete political action. So here again, got a couple of quotes from first my supervisor. Again, saying that this contradictory status to the previous report, the Our Towns report, that made it very significant in wartime. It echoed all the debates, bringing those pre-existing forms of understanding, but also, crucially, reflected the ideas that would shape the welfare state in the post-war years. And this report effectively carries that forward. It takes that conceptual understanding of this group in society, these problem families, into something more concrete. And so here, you get this kind of sense of articulation in this report. I've got a quote here saying effectively, they're trying to say that the amount of suffering is sufficient to constitute an urgent problem, because what they're trying to do, the politics of the problem family, is say that the neglected child and their family is something that requires political attention. But at the moment, this is the 1940s, and I've got a timeline just in a moment to try and put some of this across. It's a very crowded legislative schedule with lots of Labour legislation creating the welfare state, and they're trying to make a space for a new definition of child neglect, which is now rooted in the 1933 Act at this moment in time, to then advance the agenda of these kind of new children's services. So they're trying to push for a new way of working effectively. So this is why that very small window in the 1940s is significant, because as much as we look back with posterity and everything's just the welfare state and it all gets branded together. How and when things happen is very, very significant. So I'm going to start off here with the Beveridge report being published first in 1942. So for those of you who don't know, it's a very significant report done by Lord Beveridge, where he's chaired, about trying to envisage a post-war Britain through reconstruction, and he's advocating for a new mode of welfare, and that's often rooted in the very harmful experiences of the Depression and large-scale unemployment they're trying to overcome. Shortly after that, so this is a report associated with the forward-thinkingness of the welfare state. You've then got the Our Towns report published the following year, so the research was done over the preceding period of time, coming out effectively creating this moral panic about evacuation in the public imagination again. Crucially, in terms of these different things coexisting in time, you've then got a very influential letter from Lady Ellen Hurtwood, to the Times on residential childcare that effectively is Dickensian, Victorian, and barrack-like, awful accommodation. And this itself is another scandal about children that kind of looms on top of this, but isn't directly related to the one about evacuation. Now, in terms of the public imagination, you've then got the Monckton report in May 1945, where there's Dennis O'Neill is killed at the hands of his foster parents. So I won't go labour into the details, but he was the responsibility of the care in Newport, I think it was, and he was taken to Shropshire, where he sadly died at the hands of his foster carers. And there was a report into his death which blamed a lack of single control over his case and was trying to advocate implicitly for a new service of children, but it wasn't hiding necessarily to the Curtis report, which was published the year after. And that recommended having a single unified service of children. It was very critical of the fact that the responsibility for them was fragmented across lots of different areas, both for education, for welfare, particularly during the Second World War and evacuation for boarding out at that time. So they were trying to suggest we need a single service to do this, and that's where the children's departments are born in the 1948 Children Act. Then, shortly after, you have the report on neglect published. So already you've got a lot going on in terms of the changes in the welfare state bringing about these things. And here you can see the neglected child and his family, of a typo of my own on my own slides, effectively advocating for doing something new and different at a time when already lots was happening. Now, in terms of neglect, the big thing is parliamentary intervention by Barbara Eyton Gould, who's a Labour MP associated with the Women's Group on Public Welfare. And she asked two questions about trying to push for some kind of legislation or change or review or some kind of royal commission. She's not quite certain about what she's asking for, but some investigation into child neglect. Now, the second time this happens, there is a interdepartmental working group. So the Home Office, the Ministries of Education, bearing in mind education was historically responsible for neglect from 1933 Act, and the Ministry of Health. The different senior civil servants meet to effectively investigate the issue. And they, from their kind of Sir Humphrey and all the suspicions about yes minister, to say that we don't need any more legislation.
Don't tip it away. Don't tip it
Can we
away.
just ask anyone who's online just to mute, if that's okay? Thank you. So they say we don't need legislation. What we need is to bring everybody who's involved still in work with children, because the children's departments don't remove all the other responsibilities. They're still there, to bring them together into one committee at a local authority level, which is a coordination committee. So effectively, that is a result of refusing to legislate around neglect because of this crowded period of time. So I'm sorry if I've overlaid the detail, but a lot happens in a very short period of time, which creates this moment, which then shapes the next 20 years. So, park that for a second. What is the problem, family? Because this is very significant in terms of professional understanding about what was meant by the term. And come on to a moment, because it's this amorphous umbrella-like characteristic that pulls in everything and nothing at the same time. So, again, it's like my PhD supervisor, I'm getting in the good books. So why the problem, family, at the moment in time? Why in particular that term, that label? So you can see here from the two quotes that I've got, that, and from what I've just described, that the phenomenon, this idea, clearly relates to a number of important themes in the 1950s, including the emphasis on the family. And I can't emphasize that enough, that in the post-war period, the emphasis was on reconstruction, building back society. The family as the unit of society rather than the class or the group was incredibly important, both to the Labour Party and to the Conservatives. About post-war reconstruction, the declining role of eugenics, and I'll come into that into a moment, because that was the real last gasp of public health and the medical officers. That was their thing that they lent on, which unsurprisingly after the Second World War declined in popularity. The importance of its psychological theories, and this is where you can see a lot of those American ideas that June is talking about permeating through into UK social work, and attitudes to mothers and the workplace in the home. So the responsibility for children being with the mother, and that the mother's place is in the home to raise a child in an appropriate way, whilst the father works, the kind of breadwinner model that's underpinned by the Beveridge idea of the welfare state. Now, this is an important way of looking at the problem family. I just want to make abundant that there's a lot of language which is perhaps a little more less palatable now than it was then, in terms which are quite prejudicial. And it's very important to say that when we're looking at these and trying to understand the day-to-day reality of poverty, the welfare state, and problem families, that we can think we're just reproducing those same sets of understandings. So my supervisor again makes a very important point that these reports that I've talked about, and we'll talk about in a moment, about problem families, relatively speaking, tell us little about the families themselves, because they're seen through this particular lens, and more about the professional rivalries and connections. And that's where his body of work has been. And so it's that I'm leaning on this next section. So that's the idea of a problem family. What do people use? What did they mean when they said this term? Because this concept emerges and changes over time. So here I've got 3 quotes from very important medical officers of health. So they're a very important local authority chief officer, effectively. Now, before the National Health Service, they were perhaps the most important within a local authority, because they're responsible for municipal hospitals, and they had this vast empire of services and things. Come 1948, that's all shorn from their responsibility. The National Health Service nationalises hospitals, and most of their other responsibilities are taken away. So they're left with not a lot of power. So they're looking for something, a space to claim as their own. And this very much was one of those spaces. And you'll see with the dates as well, that these were all published during that same window of time in the 1940s, where they're trying to advocate a particular way of thinking. So I've got 3 quotes here. The first one is from Robert Buffington, who was writing at this time as Deputy Medical Officer of Rotherham, who then becomes the Medical Officer of Health of Bristol. And he describes this idea of derelict families, so the term hadn't quite solidified by then. These families, for one reason or another, have not kept pace with social progress. And this is a really important informal understanding. The idea that the welfare state is moving society forwards, and problem families are a drag on society, holding us backwards. There's kind of a wider understanding. They are the despair of health departments, which he's doing, education, who still have responsibilities for children, NSPCC inspectors, again, I'll come back to those, and indeed of anyone who attempts to improve their lot in life. That it's their fault that they're in a bad situation, effectively, is what he's suggesting. So here we've got Claire Salibras, who was the Deputy Medical Officer of Health for Liverpool. There's a man, by the way, it's not a woman, senior role, I mean, gender parent and all. So and he argues that the problem consists in the presence of a developed civilization, again saying much the same thing as Buffington, that there are families or groups of families, and he makes the addition advisedly, who have Stone Age standards of conduct in the cities of an age of steel. And for a juxtaposition, I really want to stick with you because I use that quote everywhere. So the last one is from Colin Fraser Brockington, who at that time was the County Medical Officer for West Riding County Council, but later will become Professor of Public Health at Manchester University, pioneering health visitor education as well. So he argues that the problem family represents a unique complex of features, no one family being quite like another. All have one characteristic, and that have been enabled by their own efforts to raise themselves from the state in which they have fallen. So you can see a lot of similarities and synergies across all of those definitions that public health speaking to this shared set of concerns. Now, part of the reason why I've chosen these 3, or borrowed them from my supervisor more accurately, is because these, along with 2 other medical officers, were involved in a study of problem families, trying to define what they were, funded and run by the Eugenics Society, which was published in 1950. So in terms of those sets of understandings, you've got to think about trying to create this new space, new understanding, but also looking for a space for themselves. Where does social work fit into this? So again, anyone that's seen me present before will know that the top quote I use all the time, because this idea of a problem family, it's hard to pin down. If you were to look back now and have a concrete, certain material understanding of what a problem family was, you can't find it because it's elusive, it's nebulous. And it's that nebulousness that's its power. And so Elizabeth Irvine, who went on to become a reader of social work at the University of York in the 1960s, writes in the 1950s in the British Journal of Psychiatric Social Work, that's as June points out, the creme de la creme of social work at this time. The problem families are easy to recognise and describe, and I hope you got a sense from the language that's already come up so far. It's conjuring this set of understandings and ideas. Unemployment, you're doing a good go at telling what it is though. Unemployment, pawn tickets, rent arrears, debts, child neglect, undernourishment, mental deficiency, mental illness, drunkenness and squalor, colds or worse in the bath, something else, are all characteristic and none are indispensable. So effectively what you've got here in this social work view is a pick and mix understanding that it could be one, it could be them all, it could be 3 out of them. But there's a sense that a social worker, by virtue of their experience, their training, their expertise, their exposure, knows one when they see one. And that professional identity allows them to be able to spot one. You've then got David Jones, who was a very influential figure in the foundation of the family service units. And again, he's writing the eugenics review. So this audience, you have to bear in mind, he's writing to the medical officers. He's trying to carve out space because ultimately public health departments are paying his bill. So he wants them to invest in what he's doing. So David Jones writes that problem families' lives are characterized by dirt, disintegration, disorder. And they are often shiftless, apathetic, irresponsible to an almost incredible degree. So again, leaning into those sets of behavioural understandings about where the issue lies. And lastly, but no means least, you've got Fred Philp and Noel Timms writing about the problem of the problem family in a 1957 publication by the Family Service Units, where they go that the problem family has to be seen as an administrative problem and a challenge to social casework. So I'll talk about this in a moment, because this is really significant in the idea of doing casework and how that's achieved in the post-war period is defined around and by the problem family, that social work has skills, the aptitude, the achieved experience, better identify problem families that work with them compared to public health. So there was somebody who had, I'd say, a more critical view on the concepts, its apparatus, the debate going on, and that lady is Barbara Wotton, Baroness Wotton of Abinger. She later became a social scientist at a number of London universities over the period, and she's quite critical of this kind of pick and mix way that the concept is articulated and its kind of nebulousness. And the effective bit I want you to take from this is that she's writing in the 1950s, and it's one of her reasons that she's quite critical of the concept. It starts to go out of fashion because it attracts this stigma during this period of time. And so the key point that she raises is that, for what I've shown you, that a problem family might well be defined as one whose consumption of social workers' time greatly exceeds the average of the local community, and that the only common characteristics of these problem families are the financial ones. So they're taking up time by different social work organisations and their families living in poverty. Effectively, the issue is of the lack of fit for the welfare state to deal with poverty. We've got lots of other different specialised sections responsible for other areas where poverty impinges on its activity. So that should hopefully lead us quite nicely into how this applies in terms of understandings of neglect and the state. So picking up effectively with coordination committees in 1950. In terms of your June's kind of quite helpful slide about documents and about things looking quite interesting and showing these changes over time, this is a really tedious piece of administration. This is a circular sent out by the Ministries of Health, Education and the Home Office in 1950. As a result of that interdepartmental working group saying, we're not having new legislation, but this is how you should implement your coordination committee. You should bring together all the different organisations in your area involved in work with children, have a single officer, don't have one among equals, who's responsible for chairing the committee, which you can see from what I've just said a moment ago, creates a lot of potential turf war between medical officers and the children's departments. And then as a result of that, you're supposed to be responsible for monitoring, supervising them and working with them. Now, it's again, in the language of the time, written with a lot of ambiguity, because the central local relations were left with a lot of direction of travel for new children's services. But again, they're left with a lot of duties and they didn't want it to be too onerous. So it is quite opaque in what it's been asking, despite the fact it's saying that every area should have a single coordination committee responsible for the neglect of children and ill treatment in their own home being the important part of this, that there should be an active responsibility by these different groups to go into homes to detect neglect. Although that wasn't part of the law until 1952, children's departments didn't have that power until slightly later on, as a result of some of the findings of the work behind this. So it's a very boring, technocratic document, but it has a tremendous power in carrying this forward. So what you have just 9 years later is you've got a review of social work done by Eileen Younghusband, who was the LSE, very influential, and her work on social work, she's pushing for generic social work as a skill rather than specialisation, but she gathers information about how coordinating committees work and shows just how much of a multitude of sins they are. And I find exactly the same thing at a granular level in my research. So there are those where at the local authority level, you have the chief officers sitting around a table deciding what should be done. Now, that could be at a policy level about how families should be treated, or about individual cases, or sometimes both. You've then got other instances where these responsibilities, because the areas are so large, are deferred to smaller area committees, where again, the area officers are left to decide on how best to work with their counterparts in the local area, about whether they're to exist at the time. So you might have a senior one and then an area one. Then you also might have a policy committee at the large level, and then an area one, and then a case one at the local level where they're trying to deal with individual children. Sometimes you have all three, and sometimes you indeed have no committees or conferences. And this is part of Young Husband's report in trying to flag these things together. It just, despite the fact there is central government guidance on what should be done, it's being pursued in myriad different ways. But don't let that fool you, because there was a clear direction of travel that the government wanted. I say the government, it's many things that the Home Office wanted. So here it's some work on central local relations being very significant. So in terms of sponsoring departments, the Ministry of Health is quite laid back. They're very permissive. They will allow medical officers' health to do things, but they won't necessarily give them too much of a steer. And often, unless there's a certain particular issue where they have to provide closer direction, they're quite hands-off. The Home Office are much more hands-on. They want a certain course of action for their different local authority committees to go in a certain direction of travel. And again, you won't really tell this by picking up the annual printed reports by and large. What this document here is, it's one of the files in the National Archives where the regional inspector for children's services for the Cardiff region, in this case, that does include South West England, is writing up a report on the arrangements that are in place for coordinating committees in the area about who's doing what, and crucially about how to get them to where they want to go, about whether what they're doing is adequate for their purposes or whether they need to be steered in a particular direction. If the problem is, as is often the case, that the medical officer is the chair of the committee and isn't doing anything, so they're more hands-on in giving a steer. So this gives greater influence to what the children's department is doing in terms of neglect. And the important point that Jay Griffith is writing in the 1960s is pointing out that a lot of these questions, they're about individual children or individual homes or individual families. And it's when the local children's department isn't quite sure what to do, they get in touch with the Home Office, and the Home Office then talks amongst themselves quite a bit, sees it as an existing precedent on the issue, or that might not be, comes to a common course of action, and then responds. And often children's officers are then sharing those precedents among themselves. So you get a real sense of how these different forms of understandings and neglect are transmitted, not command and control, top down. It's far more networked, it's far more connected. Now, if the children's departments are in the ascent, and if there is a direction of travel being given by the Home Office, the other important actor in the neglect kind of understanding at the local national level is the NSPCC. Oh no, got one more to go before I get to that. This is to sort of point out the significance of the 1963 Children and Young Persons Act, which June talks about, and I think very, very important. So what I've got at the top is, having gone through a lot of financial support given to family service units, and I'll talk more about those in a moment, or about employing social workers to do various things. They're employed under Section 28 of the 1946 National Health Service Act, which gives this particular bit here about local health authorities may, with approval of the minister, and to such an extent as the minister, you know, the rest of it. But the point of employment of these people or these activities is for the purpose of the prevention of illness. What on earth is that? In the sense that it gives a very vague, broad set of permissive powers to do things which medical officers of health are using to employ people or fund organisations. It's very broad, it's very encompassing. And by and large, again, there's a similar set of exchanges between local authorities and the Ministry of Health about how to manage them. What the 1963 Children and Young Persons Act does is the same thing effectively for children's departments and the Home Office. So it allows the responsibility for money to be spent to promote the welfare of children by diminishing the need to receive children into care, type on my own slide again, fantastic, or keep them in care, or to bring them before a juvenile court. So as much as from an individual experience, that's about giving financial assistance to families, or loans, or material kinds of support to alleviate poverty, which we know is at the heart of a lot of these interventions. The vast majority of money that's been spent on 1963 Section 1 is about employing social workers to do these jobs. So how local authorities employ that is about providing the same kind of broad reaching power which allows them to do these sets of activities with children and families. So here we are. Great. Okay. So the NSPCC are influential nationally. They're driving policy, but at the local level, every district across the United Kingdom has an inspector. They're very important on local coordination committees, and there's often a fight between older fashioned outlook, perhaps, to polite way of putting it, NSPCC inspectors. So particularly after the Second World War, you get a lot of retiring colonial officials and servicemen who come into those roles, and they don't get on with more progressive, younger women who are becoming children's officers. So there's a bit of tension there. So the reason I've got this graph here is this is the annual report. So I've just taken information from the annual reports of the NSPCC from 45 to 74, showing the number of cases being supervised by the NSPCC. I'm not saying correlation is causation, but if you look down the graph and see the year 1963, there's a huge trail off of cases under supervision of the NSPCC as children's departments start to pick up those more supportive work. Bearing in mind that during this time, as well as the NSPCC inspectors, there's also so-called women's visitors employed by the NSPCC, designed solely to support problem families or cases where they didn't want to prosecute and that support was a more appropriate alternative. So they were employing them throughout 1948-50 onwards. So they're there, and it's this moment in time, the Children's Act 63, Children's Persons Act, that has this profound impact on overall number of cases. But don't let that fool you, because this is the overall slide again away from prosecutions for child neglect. Now, this is guided by some ructions between the Home Office and the NSPCC at the national level about saying that coordination committees won't be very effective if you're just prosecuting everyone regardless of the decisions of your local committee. And it's also about the improvement of material circumstances and changing understandings of neglect as well. But there is a very broad trend of a steady decline after the end of the Second World War, despite the fact there's those same supervisions.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So, let's rush through this. So, what did I do? At the same time that the Second World War and the evacuation, the moral panic over Crusoe taking place, you had the formation of these two ways of dealing with problem families. The first is the subject of my PhD, is you have residential homes for so-called problem families. That is ones that might have been bombed out or evacuated in the countryside, but because of their behavioural poor habits, no one wanted to house or billet them. And so by spending a period of time at this residential home, they would then be allowed to go back out with this new accommodation and have somewhere to live. And this is where the residential model of working with the problem family came from. Now, originally, before family service units became family service units, so FSU, you had pacifist service units. So both of these organisations were run by Quakers primarily and conscientious objectors. And if Brentwood was providing the residential option for domestic kind of support, then family service units were providing the domiciliary one, so working intensively with families in their own home, perhaps seeing them once a day, every day for months and weeks on end, providing that ongoing support to allow them, from their point of view, to raise the same standards, often to be access to other forms of social welfare and support at the same time. So those two were born. So Brentwood starts doing this in 1939, and the same for pacifist service units. So these forms of social work are intimately connected with evacuation at that moment in time. So this is the domestic side, just to give you a sense of social work. The thing that I want to emphasize about family service units is their model of working intensively with families is incredibly influential. The Home Office really take hold of it and want it to be expanded, but family service units as a federal organisation, they want to protect what they're doing, their kind of way of working. So rather than just expanding all across the country all at once, like many wanted them to do, in order to preserve their intensive model and for people to learn how to work in this kind of casework, they kept their numbers quite small. So in terms of placements in the 1950s and 60s, it was a very high esteem one to have. But this came at a cost that other organisations effectively undercut the same model, but cheaply. So that's where Women's Visitors, the NSPCC, come from. And you have organisations like the Family Welfare Association. So what used to be the charity organisation, doing exactly the same thing. Same for Brentwood, that there were other organisations. The waiting list was enormous in the 1940s and the early 1950s. And so then you have a series of other organisations of different political, religious, other persuasions taking up. So the first one I've got here, Crowley House, is based in Birmingham, done by the Cadbury family, donating a large amount of money related to Middlemore immigration homes, which was declining its child migration and was using this as a way to step in. And then you've also got, it's still going today, I went down there for their 70th anniversary, Frimhurst, near Woking, I want to say. Where they're having the same model effectively because there's such demand. And the key with Frimhurst is they're pioneering a new way of working. So previously it was just mothers and their young children going to these residential centres. But Frimhurst was the first to include the husbands as well. So why does this all end? What is this kind of moment in time that was effectively ossified from the 1940s through to the early 1970s? What happened? Social work goes on trial. So you've got a real conceptual shift away from neglect and the empowered professional discretion of social workers to determine what a problem family was or wasn't, and allowing them to do that to a more codified one. So it's an excellent book probably already aware of it, by Ian Butler and Mark Drayford, where they talk through the inquiry surrounding the death of Maria Colwell in 1973 and the inquiry itself in 1974, which then paved the way for a far more prescribed methods of social work. And importantly, another point I just want to always raise here is about why this particular child's death draws national attention, is the importance of the Secretary of State for Social Services, Sir Keith Joseph, in a sense that a point that Harry Ferguson makes in his book about time and social work is that when he was working, a death of a child on your watch was not unusual, and that's certainly the case in going through the files that I've gone through. And so understanding why this particular instance was propelled into national coverage is very significant in social work. So there's a big state attack on the discretion of social work. You've then also got the medicalization of neglect. So during the 1960s, an American pediatrician, Henry Kemp, comes up with this idea of identifying causations of children being killed in their own home, so-called battered babies. And this is picked up by the NSPCC as a way to advance their constant understanding, which has more emphasis on abuse and harm and violence over neglect in terms of their understanding of children that can be rooted. And so they latched onto this concept very quickly. There was a government within the Department of Health inquiry into this, and they produced this guidance on how to spot the signs of potential battered children. And then importantly, there was not the Children's Act, but again, local authority social services circular, which effectively said you must have coordination committees. And the text in the bottom of the document, which says the older ways of working in these coordination committees should and can be continued and carried forward. So effectively, your 1950 problem family committees become your child protection committees and your area review committees as they go forward in time. And that's an important continuity, despite the fact you've got all of these changes. So you've then also got, and again, for lack of time, I'm just going to gloss very quickly over this, effectively the end of children's departments, that they're brought into generic social services departments as a result of the 1968 CBAM report. And the quote I've got here from Penelope Hall, emphasising a large department being important, is because looking at a granular level, like I've done, you can also see alongside this social work narrative of trying to bring together all these different discrete professionals of specialised forms into one. You've got a narrative around reforming local government because it's too small to really do what we want it to do. So this this size is really, really significant. And then you've got the unification of social service departments in 1970, and then the reform of local government in 1974. So these are all intimately connected because they break a lot of the older boundaries that these coordination committees had existed within. They kind of pulled them apart and gave them a geographical scale. You've also got the rise of new terms. So Sir Keith Joseph is associated with this idea of transmitted deprivation, kind of reinventing the idea of the problem family for a new audience. Bearing in mind, he's the Conservative Secretary of State from 1970 to 1974. He was involved in the Maria Colwell inquiry. He's very significant. And this concept has a lot of political traction. You've also got this idea of a culture of poverty, which was very fashionable in terms of community development in that period of time, brought over by Oscar Lewis and trying to understand underdevelopment in rural Puerto Rico. So the term problem family started to go out of fashion as well. And lastly, but by no means least, you have the economic crisis of the oil war, the oil shocks in 1973 as a result of the Yom Kippur War. You've got the end of the fundamental financial underpinning of the welfare state, which means that although social service departments are created with this kind of new hesitant enthusiasm about the prospects of change and an awful lot of crisis, and the financial base in which their base is pulled apart. And these people come to well from a social workers from an economic and governmental point of view onwards into the 1980s. I think it's me.
Thank you very much.
Time for a couple of questions. Anybody here want to? Hopefully there'll be time at the end after we've heard Marian's presentation. But any specific questions? You're not going anywhere, are you, Michael?
No, you're all there.
Right.
It's just on all the
You asked me to cover the period from 1980s to now, as possible to now. I thought that was quite a tall order, really. A lot to cover, huge amount of policy practice, including a lot of historical detail. So I thought I would do it through using serious case views as a sort of case study, really. Oh, thank you very much. Sorry about the distractions of technology. And I thought I started being a social worker, residential social worker in the 70s, and for much of the 80s, I was a social practicing field social worker. So I was kind of working with cases where neglect was a significant feature then. Oh, can I just ask people watching us online to mute their microphones, please? Thank you. Yeah, so I was working in the 80s. Neglect was very prevalent, present in the work that we did. And as a social worker at that time, you had quite a lot of discretion. Families in a way that I think would be harder now. And then towards the late 80s, I became a social work academic. And that was around the time that the Children Act came into force. And that had a big influence on how I was thinking about neglect and about what I was doing. And my research, I'd always been really interested from practice, really, to think about those families where children were living at home, but should they be or shouldn't they be? It was a really difficult decision to make because often families wouldn't want their children to be removed, but sometimes they would have to be. So that was the area of research that I became most interested in. So what I'm going to talk about now is what it was like to do 20 plus years of case review research. So before I started doing the case review research in England, I'd done a few studies in Wales. So it's a long time of looking at these awful cases. And I haven't put all of the references at the back of the talk, but there is a dedicated website run by Research in Practice, which captures all of the serious case review research. And I think it probably also. So thinking about the context and what's happening in the job, and also thinking about what happened as part of our research and as part of the climate at the time, when neglect was reframed as something very serious and potentially life-threatening, and what that's done to social work practice and our thinking, if has it been a help or hindrance. And also thinking about neglect and practitioner thinking and the work really prompted by Ruth Gardner from the NSPCC, who worked with us on serious case abuse, who came up with this term start again syndrome, again, helpful or not. And then I don't know what I'm going to conclude about what a serious case abuse contributed, but maybe that will be an important part of discussion. So here we go. So I have to do a name check for David Jones there. So I thought briefly about doing history of serious case abuse, and then very quickly realised that lots of people have done that instead, including a short report by David for the ADCS, which you're not supposed to apparently use or quote from without their permission. So I hope this is all right, David. So he said that report said that formal inquiries have been used to examine, understand, and respond to scandals and untoward incidents from Victorian times and even earlier. So it's not a new thing, it's been going a long time. And we've already heard from Michael and from June about the various tragedies, as they've been called in inverted commas, starting with Dennis O'Neill onwards. And they have certainly had a big impact on policy and practice. But they come with the caveat, the important caveat, and I'm not sure where this phrase comes from, this kind of well-worn cliche, hard cases make bad law. So do we learn best from things that have gone wrong, or do we learn best when things are working well? And the problem with keep going back to these awful cases, terrible impact is, are we going to learn the right lessons from it? Or are we just going to become defensive and frightened and panicked? And when we come to talk about serious case abuse, there's even more caveats that come from there. So thinking a little bit about the context of the 80s and 90s and very much the late 80s. So after the death of Jasmine Beckford, there was a reframing of child abuse as child protection, and it came alongside the Children Act, really. And I don't know any people who are practitioners around the time remembering working through the 167 questions in the Orange Book. Sorry, can you mute your microphones, please? So this was a guide for social workers undertaking a comprehensive assessment. So it was systematizing, making it less discretionary, more you have a schedule to work through. It was very mechanical, and it was about assessing risk and dangerous, and it wasn't good at looking at wider contextual detail. So the Children Act in 1999 moved on slightly from there. different way of thinking about a continuum of support and protection that you could move up and down. And the term safeguarding was used as a way of neutralizing the negative connotations that come from protection. So the assessment framework came out of that. And the triangle that many of us will have worked with, child, parenting, custody, environmental factors, a relationship and dynamic triangle, but still with a rigid timescale, and still it was potentially form-led. So there were many other child protection type policy documents around the time, but those seem to be ones to pinpoint. And thinking about what was going on as a sort of wider national policy, if we're thinking about neglect and thinking about, is it about what happens in families, or is it about overall conditions and societal issues, then New Labour, we remember the initiatives that came in there and the big drive to combat child poverty. And Shaw started the manifestation of that with centres rolled out all around the country. Every Child Matters document, which was aiming to fit support and protection together and make sure that children with additional needs got help. So help from universal services down to more targeted services. And to make that happen more seamlessly, early help, part of that common assessment framework and lead professional guidance documentation came out. And it was very much about policy through initiatives. And I did the evaluation of the common assessment framework and lead professionals. And when I was asked to do it by the DFE, they said, we're implementing this anyway. So you've got 6 weeks to find out, and unless something disastrous is happening. So that was interesting. So, interestingly, there's been much more interest in the research that I've done in serious case reviews than all the other bits I've done on family support. And, I wish it wasn't that way, but that's the way it's panned out. So when did serious case reviews come about, and what do we know about neglect in these reviews? So local case reviews were in evidence from 1988. So this moved from the national things like the Dennis O'Neill tragedy to more locally written and authored reviews. So the first edition of Working Together in 1998 established these reviews, and they were called Part 8 reviews from 1998, and they were managed by area child protection committees. Later they came to be called serious case reviews and were managed by living safeguarding boards. So my kind of involvement in this is that there were biennial national overview reports commissioned from 1999 onwards. And the point of those was to draw out key findings and identify implications for policy and practice. So me and the team that I was part of started doing that from cases from 2003 to 5 onwards. But there had been 2 previous reports about these cases from Sinclair and Bullock in 2002 and Wendy Rose and Julie Barnes in 2008. But their overview reports struggled to get a full or even partial sample. And although review reports were required to be submitted to the Department of Health at that time, there was no central record kept of how many or what their findings were. Many had been left unsubmitted in desk drawers. So the work I'd done in Wales kind of influenced what I was doing in that we looked at all of the reviews, because they had 8 to start with, and then they had 15, and then they had 20. And I thought, well, if we're struggling to get very many at all, how do we know the full picture? And I had thought naively that most children who died in these circumstances were the same sort of age as Maria Colwell, and I thought they were about 6, 7, 8. We really didn't know. So I was very keen to try and capture all of the reports to try and get a sense, and then we could start to see. So neglect featured in the little bits that we knew, but how much, to what extent was it the biggest problem? How did it work? We just didn't know. So the next 7 overview reports that I was part of researching tried to capture the full sample of reviews and the key findings that came from them. And we never did manage to get a full sample, but we got a pretty good one. And we looked at cases from 2 or 3 years later. And there were usually about 300 cases over the 2 years. So we got about 2/3 of them, sometimes 3/4. And what we discovered by looking carefully at all of the reports that we had, that the incidence of neglect So neglect was there as a background factor, sometimes as the key factor, rarely as the key factor. It was mostly there in the background. In the early days, it was sort of 66% around that. Later on, it was 75%. So the other caveat about this kind of serious case review work, so they're hard cases, bad law, is part of it. But when you're looking at these reviews, that you're already quite a way removed from the family. So you're looking at what's been written by the authors. You're looking at what's happened over time. So it's not, it's not the historical primary source in a sense. So we don't look at the practitioners' notes at the time, although they were in the chronologers. So it's interesting that there were very rarely any mentions of poverty in these cases. So when we did the reviews from 2008 onwards, when we published them, we had to have a proxy for poverty. And the proxy for poverty was poor living conditions. So when there was mention of poor living conditions, we reckoned the families were in poverty. But when we spoke to review authors at the time, they said we can't write about poverty because our commissioners are saying they don't want, that's too political and it's too exposing. So that had been said in Wales when we started doing the work, and it was said here, and then over time that shifted. So it was interesting. So, it's pretty clear to us that the extent of poverty was an underestimate. But we couldn't get hold of it because it wasn't written, and we couldn't say it's there when we didn't know if there was any evidence about, from what was written, we'd put it in. But it was interesting, but it seems a political issue, and later on particularly mentioned. So what happened not long after we started, just before, no, Baby P died in 2008-9, had a huge impact, as you all know. And in 1999, the guidance about undertaking serious creative abuse said abuse should not be an ordeal, and they shouldn't be blamed. But it was very clear. The campaign that the Sun ran about social workers and Ed Balls. I remember at the time, I won't put pictures of dead children, but I will put a picture of Ed Balls because I thought it was deeply shocking that he was encouraging people to join this campaign.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I've never.
And he didn't want to be Minister for Children. He wanted to be in the Treasury, but he was lumbered with children. So it is, serious case abuse are a very political issue, really. That affects practitioners and how they do their work, and how authors write the serious case reviews, I think, as well. Well, interesting, nodding your head about, you can mention poverty now, so that's a bit more encouraging. Yeah. So, just thinking about neglect and what we know about neglect after the Baby P case. So children with a child protection plan who die of physical assault, like Peter Connolly, are more likely to have a child protection plan for neglect than for physical abuse. And this was, these two things coincide very often. And neglect affects children of all ages, and adolescents are the most neglected age group. Now that came out from Mike Steen's work with Willow Reese and others. But it's also there in the serious case reviews and in surveys about neglect in the population adolescents come through. And I think it's, and I have done a lecture about Peter Connolly growing up. What if that little boy had survived with the neglect and emotional abuse and physical abuse? What would he would have had the profile of neglected teenagers that in the serious case review were coming through as suicides. So very, and I think it's the fact that children carry their experiences with them. So by the time you're experiences. So coexisting with other abuse we've talked about, featuring in up to 75% of serious case abuse, and also the fact that neglect is a risk factor for other forms of harm. So it can point in other directions. But one thing that we need to bear in mind, and something that we've tried to do in the serious case review work, is to compare what we're finding in these reviews with what's in the general population. So there is neglect in the general population. If you think about neglect now, well, I'll come back now, so that's going to. So that is important to remember. And certainly when we looked at mental health, there's a surprising amount of poor mental health in the general population. So it's not only to be found in these most worrying cases. So in the early kind of years when Labour stopped being in power and the Conservatives came in, there seemed to be at the same time a willingness to sort of want to think of neglect as more serious. So there's a better understanding that neglect has far-reaching health and welfare consequences, and these work across the lifespan. And the important work that Paul Bywaters and others have done to bring up to date the Babington and Miles work from years ago has pointed that out. And also, interestingly, an American authors that published in Pediatrics have found that there's a closer link with inequality and abuse than poverty and abuse. So that's interesting. And these factors place considerable financial burdens on societies. So, and I think that it's very hard to disentangle poverty and neglect. And I think the point that we came to in the serious case work that we did was that you need to both. Don't spend so much time saying, you know, does one cause the other? How does it work? But just they both need to be dealt with. So, lots of dilemmas about how to respond and difficulties of making sense of those cases where children are, you know, still in the home. Should they be in the home? How bad does the neglect have to be? How consistent? How clean? So the NSPCC wanted us to do a bit more work on categorising and classifying in neglect. So we came up with a typology of where neglect is found in these most serious cases. And in all of these cases, some of them had been fatal. Still, there is more neglect that's not fatal. It doesn't usually have a fatal consequence. So the malnutrition cases are the ones that hit the headlines. They're the ones that are the most distressing, but there are only ever one or two in the 2 years where that we came across. So unlikely to happen. Not just the babies, also adolescents. Some of you might remember the Clara Ishak case from Birmingham. The girl was eaten from the bird feeding. So unusual but horrifying. Medical neglect, where medical needs aren't taken account of. Accidents with some element of forewarning. So that could be poor housing conditions. Poor housing conditions conducive to fire, you know, unsafe circumstances. And the sudden infant death in infancy in the context of neglectful care in a hazardous environment. Interestingly, the numbers of sudden infant deaths went down dramatically. Most of you will know this when paediatricians advised parents to put their babies on their backs, not their fronts. It made a huge difference. And the other kind of thing about accidents in the home, when we, I know it's from Naomi Eisenstadt from Sure Start, she mentioned this, when we had oven chips, not cooked chips on the top of, so our environmental issues make a big difference to neglect. Neglect in combination with physical abuse is probably the biggest group children might die, and suicide among young people where there'd been history of neglect.
Could I ask you to speak up, please?
Yes, sorry. So what I want to do now is think about neglect and practitioner thinking. And this diagram is very redolent of the discourse about problem families, really. The same sort of expressions that are used about these families are what Michael and Jim were telling us about problem families. And when we used this slide before, I think I used to call it chaotic families, chaotic professionals, but I lost my nerve on that because it's so pejorative. So it's sort of what does neglect look like in families and what does it do to professional responses? So you can start with overwhelmed chaotic families where there's negative family support. So some examples that we had were the grandma was encouraging the daughter to buy and sell drugs. So, you know, it wasn't useful. Drugs, violence, mental health, and criminality. And maybe stop. Yeah. Okay. So the workers tended to have fixed views about families and fixed assessment views. So they might be thinking this is a neglect case. So there was one case that was called a neglect case where there had been 3 or 4 Section 47 investigations for physical injury, but they still called it a neglect case. Those are the characteristics of the families that most impacted their viewers. And I think what came through from the files and what I discovered as an educator, when I was marking essays that student social workers wrote about neglect, they were all over the place. So these could be students who could write a very good essay, who could think coherently. But when they were writing about these families, somehow the muddle in the families got into the writing. And that seems to be what happened in the with practitioners. So they are not very confident about what they're doing and what they're seeing, thinking they often miss the whole picture. They try very hard not to be judgmental, but part of social work's task is to exercise judgments, like what's good. And with these families, for professionals, there was too much to achieve and also low expectations. So for professionals, success is getting through the door. And often they were in a muddle about confidentiality. So they would err on the side of not passing on information, not least because they weren't very confident about their own judgments. So it's a cycle that goes round and round, and the families were often had low expectations of themselves. So several kind of learning points about this. One is that the children often go missing in this kind of cycle, in the same way that when the social worker went to visit Connolly, he had chocolate on his face, sent him away to have it washed off so she could see what he was like. He didn't come back. She didn't really notice that he hadn't come back because of the confusion in the family. And also this kind of whole cycle doesn't really take into account the environmental conditions very clearly. It's about what's happening with practitioners, what's happening with families. And I think one of the influences of this kind of cycle was it highlighted the importance of supervision. So particularly when you're working with families where there's neglect, you have to be thinking have your views challenged. So start again syndrome. Now, Ruth Gardner from the NSPCC was part of the research team, and she came up with this term start again syndrome, which is a way of saying, well, if you've got working with a family and there's 8 thick files to wade through, it's very easy to say, well, let's give this family a fresh start. Let's start again. Let's not deal with all these prejudiced views from people who've been working with them for years and years. Let's start from the beginning, which has its merits and could be useful, but in lots of these cases it didn't work terribly well. So we've got an example here, a case example of baby K unusually died aged 8 weeks, so this would be a malnutrition case. And interestingly, this child was the 6th child of the family. So I think what the professionals were thinking was that, well, they know what they're doing. They've had 6 children. It's all right. But there were differing professional views about how acceptable the poor unhygienic conditions were at home. There were other concerns as well. And there were differing views about baby's possible failure to thrive. So the paediatrician said, this baby's fine. Baby's doing all right. This is not the best, but it's okay. And because the paediatrician said it was all right, the other professional didn't feel able to challenge that. Because that was she was the specialist. At the same time, there had been serious concerns from school about the older siblings. But at the time of the Child Protection Conference, the school weren't able to attend because the conference was held in school holidays. So the important information that had come from the school about the family no longer coping and things slipping in the family, so where things might have been all right, it had slipped. And the views that the professional had about this is a new baby, this is a new start. And I think in some of the guidance at the time about supporting families, it was saying that new babies offer fresh starts, the opportunities to get things right, which is true. So the other issue about this family, a history of neglect and violence. So the violence was between parents and towards children, and from children to siblings and parents. So maternal repression, parental drug misuse. The father had conviction for violence with weapons. Now, that's going to make you pretty scared when you go into that family. And there was a sibling already in residential care. So what had happened. The mother's substance misuse had been reasonably maintained during the pregnancy, and after the baby was born, it slipped. It hadn't been noticed. So what was the learning about from this case? So there are dangers of professionals starting again with a new baby, start again syndrome. But this is, pejorative, isn't it? That these families have had a tough time, and this is what we're saying. So the increased family stresses were missed in this occasion, the worst institutions at home, the increased parental substance misuse. And professional fear leaves the children unprotected. So if you're too frightened to go in, to tackle it, to think clearly about what's going on, it doesn't help children be protected. And there was, in this case, a lack of sustained professional challenge. And instead, there's a preoccupation with thresholds rather than shared responsibilities. So this, if you remember the kind of the mid-teens, about 2015, there was a lot of discussion about whose responsibility is this child. 5 minutes back, I think you're nearly there. So, yeah. So is it who's person in charge here? And if everyone is confused, they're thinking, well, I'm only a bit player in this case, not really my responsibility. So what have we learned from serious case abuse? Has it made things better or not? So the Wood Review in 2016 called serious case abuse a toxic brand. They and local safeguarding boards were phased out by 2019 and were replaced by local safeguarding partnerships and local safeguarding child practice reviews. So in the research that we did over the couple of decades, we tried to be cautious, we tried to be compassionate and rigorous. We did find that most children known to the child protection system are protected. So it was unusual to find children in the system who came into this serious case abuse ambit. And death from abuse rates have remained stable. So how extraordinary that over this period of austerity, you could expect there to be much more child deaths. And I think since lockdown, things have changed a bit, but basically they're stable. So they're the same number over time. But if you get the help from the system, then you're more likely to do all right. So problems when cases close, when children aren't getting this. So practitioners and local safeguarding boards have said that they found our reports helpful, but serious case abuse combined with austerity have cast a shadow over social work practice. And from looking at the reviews over the years, have they contributed to defensiveness? Have they contributed to social workers having to watch their backs much more? So what about the cumulative impact of austerity, just to bring us up to right now? So Kate Morris used the expression neglect being the wallpaper of practice, and I think it is anyone who's been a social worker will recognise it as an important part of what they do. And it's still the largest category of child protection plan. And I came across a community care article from last year, which pointed out that in 2023 it hit the highest rate for child protection inquiries, section 47, driven by cuts to preventive services. Now, they often don't lead to child protection plans. So that article pointed out the irreparable damage to families getting little or no help after a decade plus of austerity. And what we found was that children in the system usually were protected. Now they're not even in the system. So I think over the years, it's been astonishing and heartening to see the continued commitment and creativity from social workers. And I was on study leave at the time of the Baby P case and came back shortly after that, talking to social workers and said, had they been put off by what happened with the Baby P case? And they all said no. It makes us want to do it even more. So I think that's remarkable. So that is just a personal reflection. I sort of felt quite upset about doing this talk, as June will know. And I thought, well, why have I been upset about this? And I think it's the anxiety of what I've contributed, that possibly it's made things worse, not better. So I think that is, it'll be interesting to hear what people think. So I've used up my time. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, everybody.
Very much, Marian. I'm told we don't get out of this room until 4:30. I'm not sure how you online are able to stay with us, but there is time for questions, comments, lots of experience out there in here. Let's not have questions unless they're specific, but just comments, please. Join in your event, your history.
I wanted just to comment on the last thing you said.
Could you shout up?
Yes, sorry. So I'm Eileen Flavin. I just wanted to comment on the last thing that you said, Marian, because it does make you feel really quite emotional. And what I would say, I retired 6 years ago. Serious case reviews made a very big difference. We've got something to think about. We've got something to learn from. And sometimes we were saying we're learning the same thing. Are we really learning anything? But just to have those cases reviewed, huge difference to us, Marian. So thank you very much on a personal level.
Thank you. Again, I can look for hands over there, but any other comments? Again, thinking back across, as the three of us have said, we were set a pretty tall order. It's been our perceptions. Download the timeline and fill in your own bits, basically.
So someone online just saying they've just completed their social work training.
Sorry?
A comment online from someone saying that they enjoyed the session and they've just completed their social work training.
Oh,
If you click on the chat, you can see the full
can
comment.
anybody see the chat? Can you see the chat?
I think the person who just put their hand up was that.
Yeah, somebody's is right. Yes.
Jackie.
No,
Nino.
Nino.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
over
right.
to you. Your turn.
Me.
I think it was me that put up the comment about social work training, because my understanding was in about the late 1960s, the Home Office very much did this drive to up the number of childcare officers that were professionally trained. And you got the emergency training courses at North London Poly for 8 years, starting in 1968, as part of that drive to take the local authorities with poor training record, low training records. So I think that was part of the, my understanding at the time, I did lecture on one of those, was it was a part of the drive at the beginning of to prepare for the 1969 Children Act. So I think that might have been quite important in beginning the dynamic of, trying to hold the idea of structural approaches versus the cycle of deprivation. But I found if I might say, it was very interesting, the medical officer of health, because I worked for Hertfordshire and we were so disappointed that our children's officer, Sylvia Watson, didn't get the post, and it was largely because there was an ambitious medical officer of health, so she was snapped up by, we didn't get him either, but she was snapped up by Cambridgeshire next door. And the only other comment I put on the chat was, my recollection is that Every Child Matters was probably 2000, not 2005, I think. I seem to be remember
Yes.
Being interviewed on it as I came back into children's work.
Okay, sorry about that.
And just a quick addition, the same thing happened, of course, when the education part of social services of local authorities was merged after the 1989 Act, when a lot of the really top-notch children's officers were replaced by the Director of Education. It's very interesting, your point there, Jackie.
Yes, I mean, the other thing just to mention that was quite a significant thing was when children's started to have responsibility for children with disabilities, which didn't happen until 1979, I think, something like that. They were under health before. So that you know, again, was a very significant because it enabled us to treat children as children first, not their health condition.
Again, we no apologetics. There were the three of us. We could have filled out our time sheet several times over. Aisha, did you have your hand up?
So
No.
yes, I did.
Yeah.
I'm the one who wrote about just finishing my social work qualification. So it was really great hearing from a social work practitioners, because the only time I had heard about the history was during a lecture. So this time hearing it from different professionals, and we have actually lived it, and just from different perspectives and throughout, it really made a big difference and sort of reinforced more, but also there's a lot I learned today. So next month I'll be starting to practice as a social worker, and this will be invaluable. Thank you very much for the great session.
Please share the introduce your social work colleagues to the Social Work History Network and share the PowerPoint. David, you wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you. It's been fascinating, and it is so important to remember it. And going back to the coordinating committees, which I hadn't looked into before, Michael, but that was really interesting, and seeing the same themes over decades from civil servants. And just to comment, I was able to go to the National Archives, and Jessamy, who is possibly there, got some papers out for us, and to see the handwritten commentaries of civil servants on draft clauses for the 1948 Act, and their thinking about what should and should not go into it, was really, really interesting. It illustrates some of the debates we've been having. So there is a lot in history, and in a way, nothing changes. My comment is that, well, to Marian, please don't feel bad about your reports. I think they were so important and so helpful and so encouraging to so many people. And indeed, the analysis that you presented was very constructive. But what I think we're not so good at is writing about what you do. There's been this whole focus on assessing risk and what are the things that make for problems. But how do you change it is really what social work is about. Social work, that the assessment of risk is the beginning, and what should happen next. And of course, there are things that have been written. But when I was an inspector and talking with people, it felt as if there's a gap around a shared understanding of what are the practical and emotional and psychological things that are necessary. And of course, in a way, that's been made more difficult in local government, because it's all about assessment and passing on to somebody else to do the work. But that, I think, disengaging the assessment from what you actually then do to make a difference is the challenge. And it has become immensely more difficult than when I was practicing in the 1980s, 70s. So my thanks to those who have the courage to go into it in these days with so many complex overlapping problems. But I don't know if other people would find that, or perhaps point me to the literature that would help me better. Thank you.
Sorry. Can I just ask Suzanne and then Sally and Bob. Suzanne, you want to come in? Suzanne M on line.
No, that's fine. I'll come in here now. I just need to switch my mic on. Thank you very much for the really interesting discussions today and really interesting points. Now, I'm a social work lecturer in Scotland, so a lot of it obviously resonates with what we teach and how we teach it. But I really wanted to maybe go back. Was the second speaker called Michael? Sorry, I wasn't. I just wanted to kind of ask, maybe, I don't know if it's comments or ask questions, kind of that concept of troubled families and those living in poverty obviously still comes up in teaching today, and really kind of how you would approach or support students in understanding the kind of demographic that traditionally we still work with families in, kind of looking at the kind of history of reoccurring themes, and how you would say that that is still kind of impacting on decision making now, and how do we get students to critically kind of analyze their own way of making decisions around risk and around harm. That still comes up now. I don't know if that's kind of comments and thoughts, kind of. I don't know if you could come back and kind of, I don't know, I suppose just that kind of idea about kind of poverty, and about how traditionally we still, social work particularly with children, kind of still work with a certain demographic, and I feel like kind of that theme over history is still impacting today. And I suppose, how do we critically get students to think about, or social workers to think about, and how that impacts on our decision making?
Michael,
I'm qualified to.
Okay.
Just because it's something you were talking about earlier about the lack of history in social work education, full stop, and that because of frontline, effectively that's been weeded out even further. And the two sides for me on history are history as when you're a green around the gills coming out social work for the first time, everything's new, and learning that the people in your service have experienced those same things and gone. And then your Marian's point about supervision, I think, is really significant, and about learning through peers, and in that sense I think is significant. But the poverty angle, I think there's no easy way to address it without a more conventional kind of historical sociological understanding of the world effectively, and about why those same issues mean that social work is interested in a certain set of issues and responsibilities as well. So I think that the two go hand in hand to support people into practice to improve recruitment and retention, but then to still maintain that critical light on why it's effectively a constellation of inequalities and marginality and deprivation that are the root causes of what is being understood.
But there's a broader correlation, isn't there, between practice in an area and a government department at the highest levels inability to recall what has gone before. And I think you end up with these cycles, because at the moment you may have noticed that the Home Office is perpetuating this new and revolutionary approach to youth custody in the shape of secure schools, as though we didn't stop using them in 1973 because they hadn't worked for the previous 150 years, but all of a sudden it's being presented as radical and innovative practice. And the historians are sat here going, I'm sorry, what?
The civil servant start again syndrome, maybe we should call it. Sally, you wanted to?
Oh, well, just a couple of comments, and I'll try and speak loudly. One thing was about the this is really coming from your talk, Marian, but it's about how so many serious case reviews came out with the same recommendations or messages, lessons learned, whatever, along similar lines. And it seemed to me that there was a great, this allowed a lot of people to criticize them and say, look, they're useless. They're just coming up with the same thing over and over again. And this is just my comment, was simply that I thought, no, hang on. It just shows that those things are so hard to tackle, to get, to improve, to move on. And to me, it was the other way around. Anyway, that was one thing. And it never surprised me when things were repeated, and sadly, how hard it is to make improvements. But my other thing is a lapse of memory, I think. But somewhere, I think I heard about the idea of not having categories for child protection plans. And I was thinking today about neglect and wondering whether how that would be helpful potentially for not having to put something in a box. Is it still a current issue?
I raised that with government at the time. It's just so much easier for the statistics to have a single category. They can't. So you have numerous categories, but they didn't like that. So
no. Shame.
Yeah, mine was just a reflection really on
Shut up.
it's a reflection on what's been said. And I found myself thinking about, I think the old term, I don't know if it's still around, is about eligibility criteria. Because I was thinking about your idea about, thresholds and all that stuff. Because, you know, some of the people who are not social workers have asked me about my job. And it's like, why do you work with those families and then not these other families? And it makes you think, because when you're a social worker, you talk to social workers about it all the time. So you're a bit caught up in that. And it's sort of the idea that there are themes of these big things to do with inequality and poverty and all of those. And then within that, you've got the complexity of individual families. And it does worry me that now, particularly with austerity, that there are families who are really struggling, who are not getting the help that they should have. And I suppose it's just a thought, it really brought it home to me, but what everyone's been saying, but that last bit when we were looking, you know, where you have the different elements, and I was thinking, lots of families have these things going on, but we're not working with them.
That's why the early help is so important, the prevention. You know, we know around the world that prevention is what you need.
Exactly. Yeah, the frustration of that.
Jane Tunstall over there, your name cropped up numerous times in the family support, etc. All ATD support.
Yes, no, so I was
poverty aware practice.
I was going to say, because well, I was going to say two things. A, and this is sort of anarchic and not the thing that social work teachers say. I think there's been a real problem about over-assessment. In all of the historical periods, there's such a focus on assessment. It's a bit foreign for what you're doing. There's absolute forensic assessment. It's actually bloody ironic, because at the end of the day, all the energy's gone into assessing. Quite frequently, also, we know you're not eligible, so you might as well not have done it. But also, it's a huge deterrent to anyone. And I'm thinking here through my Sure Start hat. I was the director of the implementation module for 7 years in the national evaluation of Sure Start, and I'm looking at Sally sideways, because one of the things we did, apart from look generally at parents in need or not in need or under stress accessing services, was the ability, and that was the big thing about Sure Start. It made people want to use it. It wasn't stigmatizing. There was none of this flipping assessment. And that even worked, I think, within the concept of safeguarding. I persuaded the DH to let me do that study of safeguarding in Sure Start children's centres, which was never the main interest. And my Sure Start, early years people were a bit sort of, what a waste of time. And I was sorry it never saw more of the light of day, because we did a quantitative survey nationally, but we then looked at 4 different models in real life authorities. And it's so long ago, and both as we're retired, I don't feel I'm breaking confidentiality to say that Westminster was one of them, and came out as having an incredibly attractive model where social workers were embedded. You had social workers seconded for half-time in Sure Start children's centres. And at a stroke, that demystified some of the early hesitancy and it just made the whole process to services very, very different. So without wanting to sort of, look all romantic and pie-eyed about it, there was so much of value in Sure Start, and it's such an irony the whole thing has just been smashed into the ground, because it didn't just work for the nice, lovable, normal, in inverted commas, families who are pretty good at getting anything that was going anyway. It did work in terms of encouraging those who were more hesitant. And whilst it wouldn't have eliminated neglect or anything else, it would have minimised the chances of everyone going, and gave, last thing, I hate the word empowered, but actually probably empowered, or at least encouraged, the more capable, we know it did from my work, the more capable or confident parents, and nudging their less confident friends and neighbours into going with them, to use young. So much has been lost, but still we go on with this session with assessment.
Thanks, Jane, for that. Yeah. Jackie.
Yeah, sorry, am I? Yes. Just 2 things. Yes, I'd just reinforce what's already been said, because when I was practicing years ago in children's work, it always seemed to me that what we lacked then was day facilities. Though your response had to be either residential or fostering, or supporting the family. There wasn't huge resources in between. But I was just responding a bit to the Scottish academic who was asking about teaching. Just briefly, I was taught by Bob Holman at Birmingham, and Bob was very good at pointing out what the research was on, say the percentages of children who bedwetted at a certain age, and saying, can you honestly, sort of when it's 10% at age 7 or something, say that that's a factor. He was very good at making us challenge our assumptions and look at what research there was, in making judgments.
Brings one back to the knowledge base, doesn't it? That the knowledge of child development needs to be interwoven with the knowledge about technique, and so much of training now seems to be about technique rather than knowledge, research findings, whatever. Anybody else with final thoughts? No, I think it's home time. Thanks very much for all of you who've stayed with us online and for joining us and for questions. Thank you for everybody who's struggled across London or from further afield to get here. I hope that we've seen examples of good practice, that it's been going on since before 48 even, and politicians councillors who've stuck their heads up and said something needs to be done. I'd like to feel that history has lessons for the future. So thanks ever so much, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, June. Bye all.